Okay, so in a way, you guys all know about this because it's about discussions we've been having for a long time. But for those people who aren't aware that what we've been talking about for a few months now, my presentation is called "The Librarian's Outburst." That's its main title, and Cosmic Consciousness: The Event of Art and Art of the Event. So, for those who aren't familiar with where this came from, why would you be? The Librarian's Outburst is an anecdote. It came from an anecdote that Dean spoke about in one of the meetings we had a few months ago in the Diagram Research Group meetings. And it was a story when we were thinking about applying to the Delta residency, Flat Time House. Dean mentioned that he'd gone to the library at Goldsmiths in the mid-90s and he'd taken out an audio arts tape recording, which was a kind of thing at the time. It's archived at the Tate. And about John Latham. And when he went to the desks, the librarian looked at what he was taking out and said something like, "That's the biggest load of crap I've ever listened to," or some such. I mean, Dean, you can probably say it better.
Yeah, she said it's the biggest load of pretentious old rubbish I've ever heard, which obviously was a kind of invitation.
Yeah, so this idea of the librarian who is so outraged by something in their collection that they can't contain this kind of expletive explosion of anger at it, sort of resonated with some of the discussions we'd been having around Georges Bataille and the formless and his notion of general economy. So it kind of triggered this series of associations around around orality, explosive orality, and this is an image from the journal Bataille edited in the 1930s called Document, in a series of illustrations that we used for a thing called the Formless Dictionary. And we had this discussion about Bataille's concept of the formless, and one of the things that the simple equations for it is when Bataille said that to say the universe is formless is to say that it resembles a spider or spit. And for Bataille, clearly this was trying to get away from some orderly, systematic, mathematical conception of the universe and bring it back into the realm of the sacred and the abject. But this particular image of this question of explosive orality seemed to sort of jump to mind when I thought about this idea of this ejaculatory explosion from the mouth of the librarian who can't suppress her reaction to this particular work of art or these discussions about a work of art. So this is where this idea of explosive orality came from, and I noticed that in one of the works by John Latham, he talked about nature as a discharge of impulse, and in the 0110 that David talked about as well, this idea of the least event, there's something about this question of explosiveness or something which bursts forth, something which just can't be contained. Maybe linked to the Big Bang, and it's certainly linked to this notion of the least event. So thinking about the explosiveness of a discharge and something linked to orality. And this, again, in the kind of chain of association, resemblances, let's say, between ideas, this linked very strongly to the important moment in Latham's career in 1954 when he kind of discovered or realized the spray paintings, which came to be called 1 second drawings or 1 second paintings, which were a recurrent motif or trope or action in Latham's work. So this idea of the spit, the explosiveness, the instant work of art that comes from something which randomly goes from nothing to something in an instant, again links with this idea of the creation of a cosmos and some sort of sense of explosive orality. These are actually done by the mouth, but in my association with them is that they somehow have something of an explosive orality around them. And of course, there may be other reasons why the librarian was upset, particularly at Latham, because one of Latham's most famous works, I guess what Latham is most known for, is this work Still in Chew, Art and Culture, where over a period of time he invited students to parties in West London, and Gareth and others can explain this in more detail, but the general idea is there was a kind of a problem with Clement Greenberg and his book Art and Culture, and Greenberg's status in the art world at the time is kind of like put on a pedestal. His ideas seemed to be everybody was buying into them. And there are a whole range of counter ideas to Greenberg's formalism, as those of us who teach art history and teach art will know about. And Latham decided to do parties, did events, importantly, participatory events, where people chewed pages from Art and Culture together, masticated them, and then that mastication was returned to the library in various containers as a chewed up book. And of course, it's part of Latham's broader kind of oeuvre, where the working with books as material is part of that thing. So this might have been the reason why the librarian was so offended, because, you know, the idea that the book might be brought back. Maybe Dean was going to, I don't know what you can do with an audio cassette, maybe melt it and put it in a jar and take it back, or maybe she'd have been very happy about that. So this link between orality seemed to be something which I hadn't really thought about, where orality fitted with Latham's work. And again, through our discussions at the time, I was reminded of this image, which took me quite a while to find for some reason, The Most Gigantic Liar of All Time, which was an image from the cover of VI, People's Illustrated, Folks Illustrated from 1938. John Hartfield, Marxist photo montage artist, very political, involved in anti-fascist movements. And what I love about this image is that the idea is, or the story behind it is, that it was overprinted so quickly and so fast because the printing press was about to be closed down. It was in Czechoslovakia. So, and it's Hitler's mouth, so you can just about see the moustache. So this was an anti-Hitler magazine cover by Hartfield, which almost became obliterated through overprinting, and so there was almost nothing left of it. But the reason I want to bring that up is that it's a correlation of image form, obviously, in this question of the open mouth and orality and speech and the speech act, but also around questions of revolutionary consciousness, which I've been concerned with for a long time. Particularly, at what point, according to Marxist philosophy, does one become conscious of one's revolutionary destiny? How does one become historically conscious? How does that happen, and when does that happen? And this is linked to the kind of other topic which we've been discussing around temporal-historical consciousness. Now, as I say, I've always been interested in how that was formulated within Marxism and Hegelianism, and it goes back to Hegel, because the whole concept of history unfolding and one becoming conscious of historical unfolding is largely a Hegelian philosophical doctrine, which Marxism developed. But I've always been very confused as to what point, as an individual, you have the aha moment of revolutionary historical class consciousness, and when does everybody else have it? And what's the difference between having it as an individual if everyone else doesn't have it at the same time? So what's the relationship between individual class consciousness and collective class consciousness, and when does it happen? But this has led me to be very interested in when consciousness happens. So there's this particular diagram which really speaks about this for Latham, because this is the 20th century convergence diagram. There's various versions of this. And this is the breakthrough point for Latham, is right in the center of this diagram. That's the convergence point. And it's in 1954. So the roughly between 51 and 60 is when Latham has his kind of cosmic consciousness convergence moment. And we'll probably look at this in more detail later, but what you have is two timelines, one for art, one for science, but basically this is kind of physical science, nuclear physics, astrophysics. So it's basically a physics timeline, I guess, broadly. And the idea is that comes together. In terms of the historical timeline, it looks very conventional to me. This is what we're taught in art schools, or we used to be taught in art schools. You know, that there's this historical progression of art, goes through these phases. So you have Manet's Olympia, the beginning of modernism, goes through Cézanne, you know, the optical relationship to visuality and various, etc., etc., the cones and the spheres. Picasso, Cubism, Duchamp, I'm not quite sure how Duchamp exactly fits there, but I'm sure it isn't an exact fit. But this trajectory coming to this point of Klein-Mondrian, which I think we could safely call minimalism, if we see that coming out of the reaction to abstract expressionism. And that coincides in 54. And there's this moment, which I'm very interested in, I'd love to dig more into, when Latham was at his friend's I can't remember their names now. They're the people who developed the O structure theory. And he was at their house and had been doing work on the house. And this is when they had a party on Halloween, I think it was. And this is when he did the first of the 1 second drawings. And it was like a breakthrough moment for Latham. And since then, everything changed. And after that moment, in around 1954, this is when he started thinking about the least event, the incidental person, etc., etc. So I just want to historicize that a little bit more by looking at, well, not historicize it, but look at the notes to that diagram. And there are various versions of it. And this first bit is important. The last step down after the one that afforded, this word affordance is very interesting here because it's a particular kind of physics, evolutionary biology concept. The one that afforded the bomb and the electronics arose from the art trajectory as much from that of science. So two incidents there, that it seems to be what McLuhan would call the electronic revolution, and of course the bomb, the atomic bomb, the development of atomic energy, the catastrophe of that. So it says, it has not been detected by commentators in either field, mainly because they defer to language logic and the primacy of spatial extendedness. Now, I'm going to go back to this maybe later. I won't overdo it. But this question of language logic is where Latham's work really coincides with Alfred Korzybski, which hopefully I'll get to talk about a bit. But how language constructs a way of thinking about the world that often gets in the way of understanding it correctly. And I think, Korzybski was precisely onto this, and Latham was intuitively onto this, about somehow the way logic operates is through the subject-predicate function of language, particularly in English, and that prevents us from having proper understanding. So the structural function of language can prevent us from having cosmic consciousness. So we have to do work on language. The problem now is the disease of the divided state, which advances and adds the politics of might is right and onto extinction. So clearly there is an anxiety here about the extinction of the human race. Again, this was shared with Korzybski and others, that somehow the way we thought, the way we think, and particularly about how we use language, is producing these negative effects in a much broader way. So the divided state, either or thinking, oppositional thinking, intensive definitions, these are all things which will prevent us from understanding the more holistic, integrative consciousness of the cosmos. So the prescription arising has been tabled as the incidental person approach to government. So this is Latham's prescription of how we resolve these problems of language and how they're affecting our understanding of the cosmos and politics, is this incidental person, which is, the IP is one, become aware of the event paradigm by instinct, intuition, and medium of expression. Okay, so I hope this is okay. Do you want to just, I'm happy to stop at any point, because in a way, kind of, if it's just me talking, it ends up like this sort of presentation of blah, blah. Are we okay with what we got so far?
I think it's really great, John. I just was going to say, I think that the Greenberg piece wasn't just by Latham, or it's claimed that it's also by Latham's student, who I'm not sure who it exactly was. I wonder if it was Barry Flanagan.
Was it Barry Flanagan?
Barry Flanagan. And I think he claims that as a collaboration. But
went on to do rabbits.
Yes. So lovely rabbits. But I just thought I'd throw that in there in case a relative of Barry Flanagan was watching. But otherwise, John, I think it's really interesting.
No, that's great. I'm really interested about this question of accreditation and crediting artworks. And there's been a lot of this around what we've been doing. So there's quite a strong emphasis that we have to kind of put copyright, John Latham Foundation, etc. And this question of provenance and attribution is very traditional. It's a very traditional historical art issue, right? Like making sure you attribute it correctly and you get the provenance right, which to me seems entirely like old-fashioned and traditional relative to the kind of radical ideas that are being explored since the 1950s and 60s onwards. So I find a sort of deep contradiction in this necessity of identifying, because as I understood this, it was a group of students, not just two people, and that they all chewed it together. So it was a collective happening. So the idea, to me, and this is part of this problem, which is a deeper problem, which is the problem of authorship in art is a problem of attribution and attaching a label to a thing in order to credit it, to make it known that those things are attached. And that, to me, is something that many artists and activists and thinkers have obviously tried to snip those lines and to make the art work collectively non-attributable to individuals. And that seems to be a really... So I take your point, David, and I really get it. And I've really recognised this necessity to attribute, but the necessity to attribute seems to me a really old-fashioned response to the question of the provenance of art.
Well, we've all four of us have worked collaboratively, and that always brings into question who's the author. Because as someone who's collaborated on things that I've really thought, oh, well, that's brilliant, that's one of the best things I've done, and thought, oh, well, it was that person who sparked that, and that person always said, no, it was that person. So I totally agree with you. I'm a great believer in, like, scenes produce artworks, and what the professional art systems do is lift an individual out of that scene and say that they're the author of this work, when in fact they couldn't make that work without that kind of collective scene. I just wonder if that then, what that means for the idea of the incidental person. And it really makes me think of something Fred Moten has written about. Moten, who is an English professor, writes about Shakespeare and suggests that we have to radicalise singularity, that you can't just see Shakespeare as this kind of genius who suddenly on his own comes up with a kind of humanist Hamlet subject. It's actually the for want of a better word, the scene, all the aspects of the time, the people, the culture, the discussion, which is not representable because it's so immense, is part of that, the singularity of that moment where something new seems to emerge. So I totally get what you're saying, John. It's difficult because we're meant to be professionals, but we don't yet have that space in which we can perhaps come up with a better way of talking about it, or language, as you say.
Yeah,
but it's very interesting. What does it mean for the incidental person? I think that's the question, and the notion of individual consciousness is very interesting within that. So,
I mean, that's. I think that's well recognised, isn't it? That there's contexts and there's things are always produced, within these wider systems. I mean, if you look at the Becker's book on the art, art worlds, it's all about the environment, and it almost seems, I don't know, it would seem to me that most people wouldn't argue with that kind of contextual understanding of things, but there's kind of question of accreditation is a form of capital, isn't it? So this is the kind of problem we're in. It's a bit like talking about money and abolishing money or something, because a lot of battles really have been won precisely over getting accredited. So if you think of a kind of film industry which has had a very strong union, and we see all the credits for everyone who's been involved in that film. Now, obviously, that doesn't cover the entirety of how that film was produced in terms of a wider context, but it does include, on a professional level, all the people that have been involved in that. And that was a battle that was won, that was fought and won. Now we don't see the credits because, the next episode or the next film kind of comes up before they come on.
If you watch it on BFI Player, you get the
credits.
Yes. So just don't watch stuff on Netflix. Yeah. I think this is we have obviously been dealing with this problem for a long time, and my sense of it has always been that and I think the example of a group like Bank, David, that you were involved with for a while, that a collective, even if it's a group of individuals, when it comes to like the operational structures of the established art world, the collectors, the galleries, the patrons, the biennials, then gradually as you get up that, the attachment of a work to an author becomes all the more sedimented, and it's like lower down the tree, if you like, in like artist run spaces and experimental art spaces where people are more open to allowing their collective experience and collective production. But as you go up the pyramid, it gets solidified, and that's kind of I'm kind of conscious of that we, in terms of the solidification of the Latham pyramid, or it's quite interesting. That's probably not correct, actually. I don't mean the Latham pyramid, but this question of attribution seems to be coming up quite a lot. Mary, have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
It put me in mind of how artists have been exploited by the advertising industry, say Gillian Waring or Barbara Kruger, who have had ideas co-opted into commercial enterprises. So that's another way of, another perspective of it.
It is. I think it's a really crucial perspective, because I sort of see it almost the other way around as well, but I won't go into that. But I can see that it's like there's a vice versa on that. Like Gillian Waring getting co-opted by VW or whoever it was, but also she co-opted, Bob Dylan. And so, there's this constant relationship of imitation, impersonation, copying, assimilation, appropriation, homage. Is what the culture does, right? And then there's this question. Then there's this whole thing about protecting your assets, your IP. These, is that right? IP. Anyway, your unique
USP.
Your IP. Yeah.
So
anyway, I'm
USP?
quite interested in what IP might. What the IP of the IP incidental. Intellectual property of the incidental person.
Yeah.
Okay, the IP of the IP. Anyway, shall I move on? Shall I? This may become relevant. I'm sorry, I made my slides slow to look cool. So I just want to say a little bit about why this comes in for me in terms of my own work. And my own work is mainly as an art educator, and over years I've been working with students and trying to think about this question: at what point do they become conscious of anything really, like about art's importance, whether or not it's revolutionary, et cetera, and you can't just become conscious at any point in time. No one can. So I've developed this thing I call the intergenerational matrix, where on the vertical axis you have the age line. So that goes from 0 to 100. Most people don't live beyond 100. Everybody passes through this thing, generally speaking. Everybody grows from 0 to whatever age they die. And they also live through time along the horizontal axis, whatever era they're born into. So this is trying to show that, everybody goes through stages of life, but they go through stages of life in different socio-historical contexts, and particularly in the case of Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, with different technological environments. And this is partly to do with trying to get people to think about how technological environments alter consciousness. So I've been thinking through this and working through this. I don't have anything particularly poignant to say about it. It's a diagram that's evolved over 20 years of trying to think this through. But, we only ever live kind of in one of these periods, but we live with beings who are 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years older or younger than us. So we live in conscious real time with beings who are differentially developed in terms of their consciousness. We all do. We only ever have. So in terms of that axis, the axis of personal development, individual development, biological development, not everybody can become conscious at the same time of any one thing, because they're not developmentally ready to become conscious of that thing. So you can't expect a 5-year-old to understand dialectical materialism, and by the time you get to 60, you realize that it was a myth anyway. So that's there's a big difference there. So the people who believe in it are usually from about 20 to 40, I would say, maybe up to 50 if they're diehard Marxists. But by the time they get, okay, that's provocative, I know. it's meant to be a wind-up. Sorry. So so I'm very interested in this question of consciousness, and at what point you gain consciousness, and the extent to which that is determined on the historical conditions of your evolution of consciousness. So, when you're 20, in 1960, how different is that to being 20 in 1860, or etc. So it's a convergence of historical consciousness and individual consciousness that I'm trying to tease out here. Any thoughts on that, by the way? Mary, yeah.
So how So if somebody was born in the 1970s, so they're Generation X, so by the time it's 1990 and they're about 20 years old, and they've the younger generation or Generation Y, what's the relationship between those two generations? I mean, would Generation Y completely not understand Generation X people, or would they just think, well, what are these young people, Generation Y, doing? I don't know. Yeah.
Well, they're roughly intergenerational because they are generational, because it's about the age at which people reproduce and have kids. So if people are having kids in their mid-20s and 30s, their children are going to be the new generation. So anybody that's got children broadly within this is intergenerational. I mean, that's the definition of intergenerational. Right. So their children will be developing their consciousness in a different milieu, a different environment, different socio-historical context. They'll also be evolving their consciousness in the same historical, but they are 20 years or 25 or 30 years older. So you get these intergenerational conflicts, which have been around since the 1960s. In fact, the 60s was a very big period of intergenerational. I mean, it's when the notion of intergenerational conflict really became pronounced, that there was from the 1950s onwards, there was this Gen X moment where the new generation reacted against the previous generation and said, you screwed up, you got it wrong. It's your fault we're in Vietnam. It's your fault there's all these terrible things going on in the world, and we're going to make a difference. So this idea of intergenerational consciousness is totally part of this. But that carries on. So each generation thinks that it's going to revolutionize and transform the generation of its parent culture. So we all exist in the same times, as it were. So by the time you get to 2000, you've got people who've lived through the 60s, who went through all that, who are in their 60s, and you get the people who are Gen Y coming up saying, so you actually, by the time you get further up, you've got three generations communicating and living in the same presence, trying to understand each other, who are all supposedly fundamentally different because they are different ages and they've emerged in different historical times.
I mean, it sounds a bit depressing, maybe. I don't know if you were being provocative. Well, maybe you were just making a joke. But it does sound a bit like that. It's kind of like that idea that, well, the Labour Party has returned to some kind of normality at last. The grown-ups are back in charge, and it's under new management and all that kind of stuff. There's still these people who are in there. They've gone past 50, they've even gone past 60 or 70, and they still have some kind of belief in a kind of dialectical progress leading to something more socialist or something, But you should have really got over that, because it is something you develop kind of earlier on. So it sounds a bit like cyclical in a rather kind of conservative way, but I wondered if you related this kind of intergenerational cycles to what Mary was talking about last week in terms of the Dmitri, Ivan, Alyosha, the John Latham's kind of three characters, the kind of instinct followed by the reason followed by the intuition, if they are followed, because I think in Mary and your diagram your diagram wasn't temporal, it was more of a kind of, there's these three elements and they kind of mix up together. So two things, Dean, there. Firstly, it was a provocation. It was meant to be a slightly mild jab. But I think there's two things about that. I actually don't believe in dialectical materialism, never did. And I think it is a problem, that this idea that there's a dialectical process to history. That's the basic foundations of revolutionary thought, the idea that that at some point, some whole generation is going to become conscious of that necessity and radically transform completely the entire society with everybody else in it, is, I think, a myth. And I've never really bought that. But that's another longer argument to be had. I do think that, when Nietzsche said this in Twilight of the Idols, I do think there is a biological correlation between growing up, maturity, and conservatism, and it's kind of widely recognised that. So I think that there is this sense of the Labour Party has grown up. It's no longer revolutionary. It's no longer radical. It's kind of very stable and liberal. I think there is just something that happens. I heard an interview with Wade Davis talking about his dad, and when in the 60s when he was anti-Vietnam, and his dad, who'd lived through the Second World War and saw tons of atrocity, and actually had really
seeing the horrors of war, saying, looking at it in kind of slightly like, yes, son, the world is a terrible place, and we've all struggled to try and improve it over centuries and centuries. But so I do think. But going back to this, I think that becoming a parent, having children, growing old, seeing more does affect people's consciousness. I think you can generalize about developmental consciousness, and there do seem to be patterns that are just there. Whether you think they should be there or not, or it would be better if they weren't, is a different issue. But that people tend to get more conservative as they get older, and people tend to be much more revolutionary and radical and wanting to change the world and make it better in their 20s.
Could I...
David.
Yeah, David, go ahead. I wanted to... I'll let David speak, but if I could, would it be possible... This might be a good time to just share a diagram, a diagram that I did in response to Mary's diagram last week. But maybe, David, you...
No, go ahead.
No, but David, say what you're going to say, because you...
Well, I think it's obviously very complex. I mean, first of all, when we talk about consciousness, we have to be careful. And also, I think it's a very Western thing, the dialectical materialist notion of time, and also even what is young and what is radical and what is old. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is itself a historical Western thing. But given that, it might be what you're talking about, John, is human time, mm-hmm. and a kind of realization that you have some agency in the world to affect that. Mm-hmm. Whereas the zero of Latham is more a kind of cosmic time.
Yeah.
So this would probably be something I'd regret saying, but the human time, which involves like mediation of consciousness and realization of that mediation, is not exactly internal, but it's a scale which might, as you point out, might be to do with how long you live, but also with how long humans have been around and known that they've been around. Whereas the zero is something outside, completely beyond phenomenal models, and representation of the zero is kind of impossible. But that might be what Latham thinks art can do. Whereas physics has worked out what zero is. It might be that in the history, as I understand it, zero as a figure comes from Sanskrit, and the word zero comes from Saphir or Zephyr, mm-hmm. meaning empty. And there's also a Mayan symbol for zero, which is a tortoise shell. So it seems like zero means empty. But in the 20th century, we know that zero isn't empty. And maybe physics and artists and scientists realized that, that there isn't this kind of zero as in nothing. There is something. And Latham's least event is the zero becoming kind of tangible in some way. So consciousness of the two things are very different, but there is this kind of attempt to put the two together in the timeline of Latham, and in your own talk. One suggests that you can have agency in human time. Cosmic consciousness, though, is a kind of realization of the limit of that agency, if not kind of letting go of it. Or in Latham's sense, the 0110 that you are yourself as a human is something to really understand. You've got your 100 years mm-hmm. or less, and you better do what you can within it, but always be in mind of the 0110 of the universe, if you like. So I'm kind of wondering if the real kind of diagrammatic question or aesthetic question is how to present zero as something socially, historically meaningful, which scientists kind of don't do, because scientists work on the idea of the community that will gradually move towards understanding more and more of the universe. And whoever discovers it, they can win the Nobel Prize. But it just becomes a basic thing that's accepted within the community. Within, Planck is accepted within the science community now. It's used as a tool. But to move that knowledge into social historical time is something different. That's a kind of different kind of that is a kind of consciousness, which that's how I see Latham operating within maybe what you're talking about, and the way that media is shaping of consciousness, but we have a kind of intuition. We can rationalize, we can intuit, and we can kind of make more than what we're perhaps first think is reality, or we first understand as time. So I think that's a bit of a ramble, but that's what I've been thinking about. I think that's to bring the zero back to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. Cool. And just to say, I think, so to go back to Fred Moten talks about, because he's a poet, he sits at his desk like a saxophonist practices in a jazz band, who belongs to a jazz band. It's only when people come together, though, that he feels something is made. And I think in an interview he says, I don't want to make work on my own so much as come together and improvise. And I think that's where I'd also question this incidental person, or the kind of intuition that at the moment sounds to me a bit like the spark from God. To go back to the discussions about the collective, I think that the coming together is not exactly a consciousness which suddenly everyone sees something, but it's kind of like that third mind thing that Burroughs and Gysin have, where you can become kind of more aware of things because you're kind of becoming this bigger brain or so it's interesting that in art schools we do not really push collaboration and collectivity, and I think that's a massive problem. We can blame the art world and capitalism, but as much as collaboration goes on in art schools, when it comes to it, everybody puts on some kind of assessment process or degree show, and it's very, very brave, the students that say, okay, this is our collective work, all 10 of us did this, and we all get the same mark. So but anyway, that's my
I totally agree. I know Dina's got his diagram waiting to come up, and I think you're right. And I think that the freeform jazz, Fred Moten, I think Fred Moten totally gets this, and he's very aware of it. But it's something that was kind of known, that in a freeform jazz improvisation where you have a group of people playing different instruments and spontaneously trying to create something, it's clear, and David, we've been involved in these things, like something happens when a lot of people are kind of freeform improvising, where a third thing, as you call it, or a third mind, as Burroughs and Gysin called it, another thing emerges. It happened with the Bughouse when we used to do our channeling sessions. Something emerges that no one could have made, that grows out of, it's got almost sorcerous, like this other thing happens. You go, wow, where did that come from? Nobody individually intended that one thing to emerge, but something does emerge, which feels like it's got agency or autonomy or singularity at least, which was not produced by any individual. It only could have been produced by a group of individuals working together.
The only thing about that is I think it is historical. It happens within the 20th century, possibly the 19th century with the Jenner Poets meeting, and it probably happens in many societies.
Isn't a choir
don't have history?
Isn't a choir like that? Isn't an orchestra like that too?
Yeah.
Though, like it couldn't produce the work without lots of individuals working together, each doing their own individual part of the thing that produces a thing, an event, an object event, an experience that is a crafted art object, but could only be that thing because all these people are working on the subcomponents of it to make it the best rendition of Mozart's Fourth Symphony ever performed, or So within music and orchestration, we also have this sense of the thing that is made by lots of people working together simultaneously to.
I think you have it in things like gamelan as well, but whether that's knowledge, I don't know. It's certainly a moment within the universe that this happens as well, going back to Latham's time diagram, and it could be it could be Wheeler's U with an eye on it, in a way.
Yeah, I was going to show that as well, actually, just to
Dean,
illustrate the
point. Dean, show.
Well, I was how do I share? I was thinking actually about the collaboration thing. I mean, collaboration happens also at a more kind of subterranean level. I mean, a bit, it's not necessarily with the people that you're kind of in the same room with. It's happening at a much more. I mean, it's what when Deleuze and Guattari talk about the diagram, they talk about the plane of consistency, and the plane of consistency is something they really get from Hjelmslev, the semiotician, where he talks about a purport, which is like it's like a kind of he calls it like an amorphous blob. It's like the kind of thought matter which exists across different languages, and where the kind of particles are formed in various different languages from what it's possible to pronounce phonetically and what it's possible to think conceptually. These then become the elements that are brought together in some kind of sign, whether that's a word sign or an image or whatever it is. So there's this something's happening which is not exactly about the individual who makes it, but it's kind of the individual then becomes the kind of name for a certain diagram. This is the way that Deleuze and Guattari describe a Galois diagram in mathematics, or it would be a Bacon diagram in painting, or whatever. But so these people don't become names of individuals; they become names of a particular process of formation, which draws on or kind of distributes these kind of dispersed points. I mean, it's all very kind of abstract in terms of how we normally think of diagrams, but it's a powerful kind of general principle that can be applied to all kinds of different things, areas.
Stuart Tate wrote his PhD dissertation about this. He called it molecular collaboration, and he would even bring in the kind of agency of the kind of objects and tools that you'd use.
So if I share, can I share? How do I do this now?
Do I stop share? I'll stop share. Maybe we can't all share at once.
Right, can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is. I'll be interested what you've got to say, Mary, as well about because Peirce is C.S. Peirce is one of our primary kind of reference points in thinking about diagrams, and I'm kind of interested in these. I guess diagrams, which are diagrams are often kind of binary, or they're kind of tripartite, or they've got four edges and so on. So like the Latham with his kind of instinct, rationality and intuition, as I understand it, Peirce develops all of his systems, including kind of logic and semiotics and cosmology and his kind of speculative, more kind of Hegelian speculative systems around these notions of firstness, secondness, and thirdness. I don't think these map on exactly to Peirce, but I'm kind of interested in maybe how they do. But just in relation to Mary, what you were doing, there's more of a kind of dynamic sense where this is a kind of Euler diagram, right, where firstness doesn't contain any secondness or thirdness, but secondness does contain firstness. Secondness always contains firstness, and thirdness would always contain the other two. So if we think of firstness as a pure kind of quality, which Peirce describes as the embryo of being, which is a very nice way of putting it. Secondness would be the kind of action-reaction, which he describes as a compulsiveness of experience, or a kind of pure fact of the world, like when you bang into a door or something. And then thirdness would be habit or law. So that would be as much about our kind of cultural habits our kind of norms, as well as the kind of laws of the universe, where kind of certain statistical ways of looking at things come together in a way that they form a regularity which allows us to make predictions about things, that the sun's going to rise the next day, or this is going to happen to this particle if we do this to it, and so on. So he will then kind of relate these to different realms, to different kind of levels of reality. So in the level of kind of psychology, Peirce says that there's firstness is feeling, secondness is willing or sense, willing being the kind of active form of secondness, sensation being the kind of passive form of secondness, and then thirdness would be knowing. So there's some kind of connection, I think. This is just a can you see that if I do that? So yeah. That's a kind of idea that maybe links to this idea of an expanding universe. So it could be an expanding universe, or it could be exactly what you were describing, John, in terms of the changes that happen over the course of one's life, where there's a dynamic expansion, but thirdness is not contained within firstness or secondness, but thirdness would contain the other two, maybe with a slight, a sense of aged wisdom, or however you'd like to put it. And
jaded.
That kind of jaded kind of patronizing attitude to the young. And then, can you see the wheeler now? I've got the wheeler up. I don't know can you see that?
No, that's not coming up.
Okay, so I need to stop share, just because David mentioned this, and it did occur to me as well. So just briefly there, the wheeler's quite a good illustration, I think, of a kind of Peircean view of or kind of Peirce's Hegelianism, really. I mean, Hegel wasn't a dialectical materialist, but he was a dialectical thinker in terms of a certain notion of progression that happens. And this seems to be kind of nicely condensed by the Wheeler diagram, which I got from David and initially, and this describes the way the universe forms, becomes increasingly complex to the level where it develops intelligent life that can then perceive the formation of the universe in the first place. So it's almost like a kind of collapse of time. This is very Peircean, actually, the way he'll describe his cosmology as coming to this point. But it does have a notion of development, and it is a kind of form of idealism, I suppose, in a way, whereby the mind, or the way of thinking about things, is not disconnected from the material facts of the universe, but is absolutely a complete part of it. So I wondered, Mary, maybe if you had, first of all, some thoughts about how this might relate to Latham's kind of tripartite kind of system.
Yeah, like as you pointed out in my diagram of the triangle, I kind of there was a middle section where there were all three elements mixing up together.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. It wasn't related to time in the same way as your first diagram was, where the outer circle had all three, whereas the first circle right at the center had only the first pure one. So that's interesting. So it wasn't developmental, in other words. I wasn't saying that the intuitive person would have all three, but the first person, say the instinctive person, would only have instinct, but they wouldn't have rationality and intuition. So that's interesting. How, in other words, how does your first diagram relate to the third one?
Yeah, because this is, this was a diagram I did prior to us starting this, this is the way I was thinking about diagrams, that they have kind of three levels. We might think of them in terms of three levels, which would include the aesthetic as well as the logical, which might be something like an algorithm, and the rational, which might be something like a kind of mechanism for describing something like perspective or something like that. So this, again, I don't know how this might. I've got logical there instead of intuition, so I don't know how that might relate. But yeah, it's a different thing. It's not a dynamic system in the sense that it describes time, but it describes more like it's the entire. I don't know. It's a way of. It's a kind of schematic way of thinking about the different elements that might be involved.
Yeah, it's interesting how geometry then can operate, because then in order to have that progression, like the first is just one thing, and the second is two things, and the third is three things. That's a better way. The triangle I can't really conceive immediately how you would express that in a triangle.
Lacan does kind of interesting things, doesn't he, with arrows and stuff. So if you start introducing arrows, then there's certain ways in which one thing does come before another or something.
Okay, yeah.
But of course, the more direction you give, the more directed you have to be in your reading of it. So it might cut down possibilities as well.
Is there?
We can kind of map the Peirce onto the Latham. If the firstness would be, I guess, intuitive feeling, and the secondness would be impulsiveness. So that would be instinctive, and then the thirdness would be habit and law, and I guess that would be rationality.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. I was thinking that instinct came first on for Latham, but that might not be right.
Can I respond, Dean, to that?
Yeah.
Perhaps with if I go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so you asked me. I mean, I as you know, I'm not so familiar with the Peircean concepts of firstness, secondness, and thirdness, apart from what we've discussed. But I get a sense of it. And your question was whether or not there was a kind of developmental logic to the relationship between instinct, rationality, and intuition, like that. And I could say that again, with Latham, it seems that those are three kinds of entry points, if you like, to the world. One could have an instinctive relationship to the world, a rational relationship to the world, and an intuitive relationship to the world. They don't exclude each other, but my common sense understanding of that would be that instinct comes first, like just developmentally. We are born with instincts. We are not born rationalizing. We develop rationality, and we develop rationality through the acquisition of language. And then I would say the interplay between instinct and language may be what leads us to a later level or a different level of intuition, which integrates both instinct and rationality.
But can I just say that do not young children have intuition? Like they'll stick a finger in an ear before they have rationality, and they explore the world.
No, I still say they have instincts before they're sticking fingers in ears.
They might have instincts before they're sticking fingers in ears, but they will be exploring the world intuitively.
Okay, I think I would say that's
any kind of understand, like the rational is not.
Well, I think we have to, like.
It's just a question.
No, I get it, David. And I think I don't know enough about Latham's understanding and the meaning of intuition. I know that intuition is a highly contested concept and category of experience that, is, some people think it's pre-rational. Some people, so again, I really don't know how Latham configured it. But perhaps if I was able to maybe demonstrate this through use of a physical object, the structural differential, which I have sort of on the table here.
One you prepared earlier, John.
One I prepared earlier. So, just this is how Korzybski, Alfred Korzybski, who I was going to talk about later.
You should go full screen. Stop sharing the screen, maybe, and
okay.
So we can.
Okay,
see.
Are you seeing me now?
well, hopefully you can be made big within the... I can see you definitely clearer now. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't know. You can change maybe. I don't know. I thought usually when you spoke it came up. Okay. So I just want to do this for various reasons, and I won't go too far into it, but some of you have seen this before, but this is Alfred Korzybski's structural differential, and it was a device designed to make us conscious of the processes of abstraction that the human nervous system is involved in all the time. And if I can just speak immediately to this idea of the instinctive, the rational, and maybe the intuitive, which I think intuitive is more complex, and to the Wheeler diagram, is that what this thing represents here, which is a sieve, which is a three-dimensional object, which is supposed to go outwards endlessly, infinitely in space. It's a representation of what Korzybski called what is going on. That's in any moment in time, what is going on is created by this. It's the front of a cone that goes infinitely out. And these strings are what we perceive of what is going on. And as humans, our nervous system has to abstract from what is going on in order to perceive anything. And we have a particularly designed optical structure, physical structure, cognitive structure, which is a product of evolutionary biology, which sees the world in certain ways. And the point is, we only ever see a fraction of what is going on. And these strings represent the tiny little bits coming off from what is going on. Now, the crucial thing here are two things, is that an object, and this is for Latham too, an object is already an abstraction from what is going on. What we see as an object is what we see as an object for us, like, a glass of water is an object for us. We can't see the submolecular level. We don't know what's going on. A glass of water 3 seconds ago is different to glass of water now. It's changed. And every object is, in fact, an event. This is close to Latham's thinking, right? That's just a kind of more philosophical idea. This glass will not be with us. It might outlive me. It might not. It might be disintegrated. It might be smashed. But everything that we call an object is, in fact, also an event. So all objects are events. So Korzybski talks about objects as object events. The point I'm trying to make is that we can perceive the physical material properties of object events without language. We have instincts which enable us to perceive, sense, touch, manipulate the physical properties of any object event in the world. And we can do all that without language. Children do it. The dog can do it. I throw this for Fido. Fido goes and brings the ball back. So it can perceive an object. It can smell an object. It has senses of an object. The phenomenological dimension of objects doesn't need language for us to experience it. We can experience it instinctively. The only time we can start talking logically or rationally about an object is when we've identified its particular properties. That says red plastic ball, i.e., when we've travelled from the representational realm, visual representation of objects. This is a 2D screen. This is why everything that happens in the 2D screen is an absolutely just one slice of what is going on and a massive reduction of what this object is. So this is a massive abstraction. So the screen is an immense abstraction from what is going on in the three-dimensional physical universe. So for instance, you're all in your rooms staring at a camera, which is flattening the perspective. It's only one slice. You can't see behind me, unless we're completely trapped in this slice of existence of 2 dimensions, which we speak through our faces, through faciality, through this thing. So that's what the 2-dimensional representation of the world does. It massively abstracts from the 3-dimensional, which has dimensionality and exists in time and can clearly be seen to be existing in duration. But you don't get to the rational, the logical, until you've entered into language. That's the basic hypothesis, I would say. That we can't start talking about, rationalizing, reasoning, discussing, having conversations about whether or not the appropriate word for this is red or crimson, or whether or not, in fact, we should call it a sphere or a ball, All those things can't happen to events of language. So the rational, logically, in terms of developmental psychology, the intuitive, the sensual, the phenomenological precedes the rational. Now you might call that instinctive, but the dog can chase the ball. It has instincts it can recognize, etc. So I would say that from that perspective, the rational comes after the instinctive. But as for the intuitive, where you start to make a deeper correlation, where you start to look at sort of like similarities, inferences, you start to look at categories and generalizations, you move to higher levels of generalization, higher levels of abstraction, and that enables you to make propositions about the physical universe, the nature of the human, etc. And this is where it turns into Wheeler's diagram, because when you get to the highest levels of abstraction, according to Korzybski, it comes all the way back to tell us about what is going on at the quantum level of reality. So in order to get an understanding of the quantum level of reality, we have to go through these processes of abstraction and that is historical. So that process is why we have a better understanding or a newer understanding of what's happening at a quantum level in the universe, because we have this abstracting process that enables us to do that. And that gives us understanding of things like the Big Bang and the least event. That was quite a lot. Sorry about that.
The interesting thing for me in relation to diagrams is where media fits within this, because it's not the case that media and technology is the opposite of intuition in science, it seems to me. So John Wheeler, in the essay where he reproduces that. David,
can I just pause? Oh. Who said that? Who said that technology is the opposite of intuition?
I don't think anyone said it. I'm just saying that it seems technology is not the opposite of intuition, and I only thought that because of reading what scientists do. And John Wheeler, in the essay where he has the U with the I, he talks about Einstein and, strangely, the Duke of Wellington, because the Duke of Wellington apparently would go somewhere to fight and would travel through terrain and would be aware of when terrain was changing. And I think what Wheeler is trying to draw an analogy to is the way that physicists, through working out mathematical equations, also spot terrain changing. And then the analogy here is to black holes. And I think that's interesting that that there's a kind of intuition there that's working completely on the abstract, because the Korzybski machine does its job with a kind of human scale, but it would be very difficult to do that with a black hole. A black hole is something that cannot be perceived except for its effects on the space surrounding it.
Yeah, but the possibility of human consciousness to conceive of a black hole is for Korzybski, is made possible through language and the higher order functioning of the human brain, human cognition. So that's all. And certainly, just to say, for Korzybski, who is a scientist and was a scientist and a mathematician, it's really not. There's no opposition. It's all about non-opposition. In fact, it's all about non-identity and non-opposition. There isn't an opposition between art, science, intuition. These things, they're all multivalent human capacities. And certainly the scientist uses intuition. So intuition isn't something that is restricted to certain kind of fields of human activity. But I think you're right in saying, again, I'm thinking this now, I haven't thought this before, that there is an understanding of intuition, a popular understanding of intuition as something instinctual. And I don't think that's what Latham's talking about. And I think we have another understanding of intuition, which is something which combines the instinctual with the rational at another level to have insights about what is going on. So we need the rational in order to be intuitive.
I guess where I was going, just to finish, is that it wouldn't necessarily just be language. I think it would be mediation. I think it would be technologies of all sorts shape intuitions, it seems to me, and the human language technology mediation machine is very important to for me. I think that's how I would understand intuition perhaps changing, or the reach of intuition, if you like. I guess the question is whether the human is in an assemblage, almost like a sort of Spinozist union, or whether the technology is just seen as some kind of add-on to the human. But I wouldn't follow that last idea, and that's why I was trying to bring diagrams into that as a one more kind of technology that because in the diagrams that we make often function through language and through intuition. Sorry if you were going to make that point, Mary, but I think that's the important thing, is that that we have to kind of question this idea of what is human and what is intuition, unless we bring in the non-human. Sorry.
That idea that diagrams are technology is really interesting, and that's quite Peircean. That Peirce was saying that diagrams can activate thoughts. And also, John, when you were talking through your sculpture, and I think you were saying that intuition is the last stage of thinking. That's where new things can happen. Is that I was
conjecturing that,
yeah,
as I was using the device, but yeah, I just had that thought then. But
that's very Peirce's notion of abductive thinking, where he does say that you generate an infinite amount of hypothesis, and you're using intuition, and that abductive thinking is where new ideas come, and so that's crucial for scientists. So we always think of scientists as thinking rationally, but they're also using through abductive thinking, they're also using intuition to kind of conjecture and imagine.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah. Let's just say that Korzybski refers to Peirce throughout Science and Sanity. So, and the other philosopher that's really crucial is Alfred North Whitehead, Process and Reality, and also who wrote the book with Bertrand Russell, of course, on set theory and mathematics. So, yeah. So Peirce is
I'm just wondering about this incidental person, though, which again I come back to with, like, you don't need a machine or a device to know whether it's rained or not, because you can look at the ground and see it's wet, and you can abduct. Oh yeah, it must have rained. But you do need some kind of devices, some kind of external processes and devices to work out how the solar system works, in a sense. Unless you can do it all in your head. I guess Stephen Hawking could do it all in his head.
Well, diagrams are intuitive in that sense. I mean, that's one of their practical, everyday practical functions, is they make something that's in your head, as we say, which is a kind of spatial metaphor, right? They actually lay it out before you and stop it in time, so you can kind of wander around and take your time exploring it, and and that would be the same with thought experiments. Like someone like Einstein or something. I mean, it's a kind of intuitive device, isn't it? For which is it's a different type of device, I suppose, from a kind of indexical device that measures something and makes it physical, which again makes it kind of intuitive to us, but by other means.
I think there's a kind of there's an interface that we're looking for all the time as humans. It's interesting. Like last week we spoke about Terry Atkinson and the Greaser works and Warhol Greaser, and I had some contact with Terry, who kindly sent me a book with some writing, and his ideas about the Greaser, which is not a flat surface, but a relief surface with some grease in, which when the painting is stored, because that's what it is also functioning as, the grease moves. He called the grease software, and he termed the painting, the wooden bit with the paint on, hardware. And he was interested in the software functioning when he wasn't there, kind of thing. So I guess I'm wondering if the future of he's also really interested in the kind of subject of the artist and what that is, and critiquing that. And I think that I found that really interesting, the whole idea of like the work of art as a hardware software assemblage which works when the artist isn't there, kind of thing as well. So I guess what I'm wondering is if this is all a bit too human centered at the moment, the way we're, what the part of mediation and technology seems very important in all aspects of our diagramming and of our knowing and of our exploring things.
Well, I'm very explicit about it. I think that we have to really avoid certain ways of thinking about these things, and digitization of culture is a problem. I was mentioning it earlier, and I'm really, it's too long a conversation really to get into that Atkinson calling the work, referring to software and hardware. I mean, it's an interesting proposition to make, and certainly there's some truth to, you could formulate things in that way and think about them in that way. We obviously incorporate in our language the technological metaphors of our time, and those were probably the technological metaphors that were around at that time. It's always happened, and so I don't know what value it would be for us as humans to deprioritize the human.
It's not to deprioritize, but it might be to ask to follow maybe Lee Smolin, who believes in evolution and time, and that things, if the laws of physics can change through evolution of time, does intuition change or at least intuition's reach and how it functions? The digitalization of culture is, very problematic, but I'm not sure the use of the digital within science is the same thing. And I think that I have reservations about the modelling of the universe in simulation that scientists do, and then they just talk about it either as like the bulk brain dimension, but it certainly allows the imagination to travel in ways, and see things that weren't there, because it's also combined with maths, and it's to me an interesting question. That's why I'm asking about the incidental person, as it's something particularly 20th century, and maybe the full effect of the devices that humans make on ourselves is not yet kind of apparent. Because if Daniel Dennett can say, I think Daniel Dennett might have said consciousness doesn't exist now, but I remember Daniel Dennett saying,
just a minute, Dave. Should we wait for Dean to come back?
Oh, is he gone?
Lost Dean.
Oh no.
He had problems with the connection.
Now, am I all right to go back to my presentation?
Yeah.
We were in the middle of something, but that's okay. We always are.
We were last talking about your graph, the generational graph. Is it?
Yeah, I think there's something. I think what we're talking about, it would be really good to go back to Latham's convergence diagram and look at that again, because it seems to me that as we're talking, it's really, again, I'm getting insights into this. And this was the last part of the talk, the event about the art of event. And anyway, I won't talk about this too much, but I love this image, organism somewhere. It's so sci-fi. I love the idea in this instant, 1 second painting or drawing, this explosive thing might in another universe be an organism. I just anyway love that. But if we go back to this, is a detail from the 20th century trajectory. And of course, I was, when I talk about this trajectory of the history of art, modern art, from Manet to Klein and Mondrian, and this parallel development of science, we haven't really unpacked that. But as we were talking, and particularly when I think Dean or David, I think it was Dean, talked about a diagram being an intuitive device, right? Like, so it's a mechanism. It's a kind of cognitive or an abstract mechanism which does intuitive work, which couldn't happen without the plane of assertion, which is the white surface on which that is drawn, without language, which are all these words which identify things, which are pointers, and these arrows and lines, which we've talked about a lot as the elementary components of diagrams, lines and arrows and timelines. But the point that the thing that came to me as we were talking was this correlation between science particularly when you were talking, David, about how, okay, so you said that scientists need devices to come up with these models of the universe.
I think if it might be not need, but what I'm thinking, I mean, I don't have the same take on the digital as you, because I think the digital's always been there in some form, and also I think we've always been kind of post-human, to follow and Catherine Hales to an extent. But I was thinking that, you know, like lenses changed things.
Yep.
And they almost become part of us now, because science can kind of change the lens in our eyes. And
lenses always were part of us. That's where lenses came from.
So I'm wondering if the same thing is true of the kind of the digital image, which is kind of an extension almost of imagination. But I'm not suggesting that the digital is good per se within our culture, but in that scientists are trying to get at something that's beyond perception and the phenomenological.
Yeah.
And that they can do that using equations to a point, but they have often communicated with each other and to non-scientists using imagery or devices. And in that they have used such things as computer simulations, and I think that there would be some kind of digital aspect to understanding the information to track the fact that there's spooky entanglement. You know, I just wonder if it's possible at all for us to bracket outside of intuition and the incidental person, as maybe I understand Latham might be suggesting, all of this in the same way that Fred Moten would not say there is just a Shakespeare. There's all you know, the kind of stuff of the singularity is immense and too big to represent. I'm just wondering if there's the same argument to be made with technologies and devices, and diagrams are kind of part of that.
They are, and I don't deny that. And I think that's another sort of it's another trajectory through this diagram. I would say. I think you could map a technological trajectory through this diagram too.
There's one more thing which I thought of when you mentioned Whitehead, which is that there's a guy called Mark Hansen who I find very interesting. I don't always agree with what he writes, but he suggests that, you know, in Western philosophy and critique, so much emphasis has been placed on language and the intellect, but what's been forgotten is the material and the non-conscious. And which is a Whitehead kind of thing. Which
it's also Korzybski.
Yes,
Korzybski is very clear that
yes.
it's the intentional use of language, which he traces back to Aristotle, which is absolutely encoded Western culture and Western logics and Western thinking, that is the problem. And you have to get beyond that mode of linguistic thinking. And there are ways of accessing what is going on that is blocked by our use of language. Language blocks access to something. And so, you know, and Latham was very clear that he knew that there was something that we needed to do with language to enable us to understand what was going on. And I just want to say a couple of things about this diagram, because you said
lost Dean again, by the way. But
no, we haven't.
Oh, we haven't.
Still there.
Oh, great. Sorry.
So you see, you said scientists are trying to get at something beyond the phenomenal, right? And of course, they want to understand what subtends the phenomenal, what's beneath the phenomenal, what makes the phenomenal, etc. Now, just in this diagram, what I really want to try and articulate, is that I'm wondering if we treat these artists not as Manet, and I thought it was Monet, and I actually think Monet would be better there for me because of the optical question rather than Manet, but it's a realist question. But if we go through those and we don't treat these artists as artists, but as, like Dean was sort of saying, in a kind of conceptual persona, Deleuze and Guattari sense, that they created new mechanisms of accessing the non-phenomenal or the sub-phenomenal or the beyond of experience. So you could see that each of these artists is trying to access something beyond the phenomenal. And Latham is obviously seeing a correlation or mapping a correlation between how scientists are thinking through the beyond the phenomenal, the subatomic, the relationship between energy and matter. And for Latham, clearly, what artists are doing when Pollock makes a drip painting or Joyce does a stream of consciousness piece of writing, they are similarly making discoveries about what is beyond the ordinary phenomenal perception of things, I guess. And I think that is a trajectory of art, that the trajectory of modern art was that it was seeking something beyond certainly the naturalistic, the observable, maybe the phenomenological, moving towards deeper abstractions, ending up with, in this case, I guess Klein blue, just the blue paintings, and Mondrian. But it was specifically Rauschenberg's white paintings that really that Latham. So I guess the question I'm asking here, and I just want to show, there's this kind of trajectory towards the notion of that art as event, or the event as art, that somehow art becomes evental. And Pollock is really seen as crucial for that because of the action painting and the idea of the process. That increasingly art becomes evental as it moves in this trajectory. So this convergence with science and art, contemporary art, I'm still trying to tease out what precisely that is going on there. But certainly between 51 and 62, this is right in the area where where Latham sees Rauschenberg, the white paintings, which he then makes various instantiations of, like the glass and the white panel. And there's something about this event in art as being an event which indicates or coincides with this event in historical time. And I guess I'm still trying to work out, is that a real historical event? Going back, David, to your claim or your proposition that the laws of the universe actually change in time.
Oh, well, that was Smollin's proposal.
Okay, so that's
Peirce as well.
Okay, so
that's
are we actually
thirdness? So law is thirdness. So that would be a kind of regularity that sets in, but it's not eternal, and it's not.
So what is
this?
Law is
contingent as much as anything else. Sorry.
So do we think? Do we think that at this historical period, 1951 to 1960, in the history of Western science and Western art, something happened that was properly a transformation of the laws of physics or the laws of the universe that artists and scientists simultaneously had a shared intuition of?
It's surely not the laws of the universe that change, it's our knowledge or our perception of these laws. And maybe that something happened in the 50s to change our perception.
I think there could be, because there could be something in that, Mary, because with Cage, for instance, I think that I don't know when it happened, but there was definitely a kind of looking east.
52, and it was Suzuki's work in Zen and the influence of Zen Buddhism at Black Mountain College, where Rauschenberg was as well, and this whole idea of the event, the performance, fluxus, all that is nascent in that moment of treating the event of art as a temporal phenomena. Like it's a temporalization rather than the objective. This is also a trajectory of the dematerialization of art.
And I think, a Marxist would say, modernity happens and art is impacted by all sorts of forces and events which kind of free it up and give it an idea of history and progress. So it just seems so complex, the different influences, because it looks like relativity happens at the same time as cubism, but it's very hard to kind of say, well, they've got some obvious relation. In them, there is a shared culture, but I think that if there is something, I think it's like trying to work out zero happens, but how related it is, and because having recently been looking and listening to the influence of Eastern music on Western music, like I think it's Pran Nath's influence on Terry Riley, for instance, or there is a kind of notion of consciousness there that seems a million miles away from quantum physics, although there might be some link. I don't know. Maybe Terry Riley read quantum physics, so it's hard to know without further work.
Could I just in terms of the link between Duchamp and Einstein? Could I show you something?
Yeah.
So I showed you this briefly before, I think, but and this is the first diagram, probably the first art diagram I did. This was made with Bettina Eberhard. But this is, and I think that I was probably influenced by Latham. Thinking back on it, and when you were relating that anecdote, I think I was actually very interested, so intrigued by this idea that art could grasp the real somehow and actually kind of be involved. So looking at Duchamp, who's really he's really one of the kind of key diagrammers, not just a diagrammer, but someone who described his own work in terms of allegory, which I think is something we haven't really brought in yet, but is a really interesting kind of connection. But it turns out that Duchamp's own ready-mades were just a kind of little kind of hint, a little kind of clue at this much kind of bigger thing that he was involved with, which was basically building a time machine, which the large glass is a kind of visual kind of equation for. So if you actually fold the glass in half, you get the three-dimensional representation of four-dimensional space, which kind of solves the equations of how to go back in time. When he went back, he then split the universe, because obviously that's what happens to avoid the time paradoxes and so on, and became this figure that we know of as Leonardo da Vinci, who obviously was another kind of iconic artist engineer, and then kind of zoom forward again. So looking at all these notes, all these copious notes and stuff that kind of Duchamp had collected in these boxes and stuff, putting them together, you kind of discover this, So you kind of read this from right to left in a way, because we're obviously the right side represents the time we're at now, and then having to go kind of back to the place and then kind of switch forward again. So we live in reality too, completely oblivious to. So we're just a kind of an art. We're all kind of living in a Duchamp artwork in that sense. I mean, I'm not sure about the Pollock. I mean, it's funny with the whether the Pollock is a step forward or a step back. I think Smithson, probably, who David mentioned last week, is the more interesting kind of development forward. And I don't know what the connection, what Latham thought about Smithson, but Deleuze would say that whereas Mondrian is digital, he's dealing with a digital diagram. Pollock is dealing with a one-to-one map. So for him, the index is always a kind of form of re-territorialization, and it doesn't really do the kind of ambitious thing a diagram would do, which would really relate to a kind of analogical language. So analogical language is different from the digital language, which and very much relates to instinct, because it's kind of what happens when you communicate through, in response to the way that your kind of chemicals are reacting in terms of how what's happening in the environment. So it's kind of like dogs growling and all those things that kind of Bateson was very interested in terms of dolphins and so on. So there are different types of language. There's a digital language, which is the kind of the way that we write down these letters and these words, and they have meanings, and there's set ways of organizing the word grammatically and syntactically and so on. But then there's this other form of communication which is analogical and is very, very physical. It's very material. It's kind of chemical. It's about noises and sounds and body action and all those kinds of things.
Experiential, phenomenal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. And one of the reasons I just put, I think I put Pollock in there. There's lots of things, but I didn't put him in there. Latham put Pollock in the picture.
I'm interested in.
I think that it's Latham who sees Pollock as an event, because certainly maybe it explains the hostility to Greenberg, because Greenberg would not see Pollock's painting as anything other than some kind of Kantian specialization where you realize that there's this canvas and every mark emphasizes the flatness of it, and it's all about a kind of composition that has this balance of push and pull. And I think Pollock followed Greenberg a lot, or certainly wouldn't have thought about it as a kind of aftermath of a performance, even though he would talk about like making the work, and Greenberg said about Pollock, sometimes you're hot and sometimes you're not, i.e., you're making this composition. It's Latham, though, I think, and maybe everyone else sees it too, that the Pollock painting brings in time, because you can see how it's made, and the Rauschenberg is almost the kind of condensing of that painting full of gestures into no gesture, if you like. I think it is a very original idea, and maybe that's the point for Latham, where time is somehow registered within artworks and events are registered in artworks, which, I mean, he's critical of science because the quantum is just a series of kind of is only understood probabilistically. So I think I don't still quite grasp it fully, but I think that in art you have a kind of practice of events, or a practice of understanding events. So that's how I would see that Pollock painting. There's almost like a kind of stage to that. I think that's how you've presented it as well, John.
And it's to do with, there is this move towards, anyway, I'm repeating it, but just, I was thinking about Alan Caprow and the happening and the language of the happening. And Caprow, saw Pollock as that was the most important event. You're right, it's the event of Pollock, isn't it? It's the event of Mondrian. These are it's about what they do as artists, as some kind of, so Pollock. Yeah, so this, you're right, I think it's completely different. Greenberg's approach to Pollock, as I understand it, is not what Caprow or the artists who were inspired by Pollock was to it. It wasn't about formalism. It was about the action, the event, the process, the dance, the drip, the gesture. This was all the stuff that artists were more interested in, the time of the work, not the finished work and its place in a nice linear history of the development of abstract painting,
which Fried would say is kind of timeless, I guess, as well.
I mean, I was thought I might bring this. I don't know. Can you see this? I just thought as I'm sharing the screen. So I think Latham might really disagree with me here, but I see these sculptures as allegories. I see the book sculptures as allegories, and I saw one of these in the probably the first Latham sculpture I saw, as opposed to actually seeing him talk and listening to him talk. It was at the Courtauld Library, and in my imagination it was hanging from the ceiling, right? It was hanging in a big lump. But I've tried to look for this, and I can't see any hanging sculptures. But I guess if it's not on Google, it doesn't exist, right? So it can't be real. But it might actually be a figment, because I always kind of related it to this other Chris Burden and wonderful work. But I've lost the Latham now. I can't get it. Yeah, this is to me, this doesn't seem like a kind of I don't know, like an index of an event that happened. It feels very much like almost you've got these kind of cross dimensions coming in. So it's kind of functioning like the kind of ruins that Benjamin would talk about, like the way that time becomes frozen and fossilized, like some kind of primitive landscape, and that we then time stops. Actually, this is the way Benjamin talks about the allegory, that time stops, the kind of arrow of historical time, at least, kind of stops, and we have this kind of frozen again, a kind of spatialization, but very kind of physical spatialization, where we feel we can maybe reflect upon this thing. There's a kind of possibility for reflection upon this very material kind of image or object.
I think it's hard to do anything with that object.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And I think, which doesn't make it bad, but I think I'd agree with you that you start then to think, what does it mean, and why is through the book at such a right angle? So last week I was going to show the Robert Smithson spiral jetty and the Carolee Schneemann up to and including her limits, I think it's called, and that the Carolee Schneemann work seems to me to be kind of one development of what we're thinking, where there's a document now that exists that seems very diagrammatic of the artist hanging in a space naked, and all around her is the space that she's been able to kind of inscribe, and it's very kind of tautological, but it's also quite allegorical as well. And then the Smithson, I don't know whether it's a diagram, but it's something that you can walk on, and it's called a jetty, and you can park something next to it. So maybe these are different functions of diagrams, but there's definitely within Latham's work a sense that they're neither like the Schneemann, which is the aftermath of an event. Maybe the roller blind is a bit like the Smithson thing, but it's not quite, because the Smithson thing, the image I was going to show of the spiral jetty, is covered in salt, so it's definitely a thing that is changing in time.
Yeah, he's managed to bring in these other processes, which is quite incredible. So I think whereas the Pollock, we see it very much, or the way kind of Krauss would talk about it or whatever, it would be in terms of a kind of index of a process, which is very much Pollock's own process, right? And we have the famous footage of Pollock doing it in the outdoors and that, and but in fact, that Smithson is much more Deleuzian in that sense, that he's kind of managed to manifest these kind of, pre-molecular whatever kind of process. Yeah, that's saying molecular in a Deleuzian way, which means there's things that are there's a kind of way of thinking of things in terms of what happens prior to kind of molecularization and kind of molarization, if that's a word, whereby there is a kind of potential for stuff to happen. Now, Smithson has to, Smithson is involved in a very kind of strategic project, which involves a lot of money and a lot of different people to get this stuff laid out there in the first place. This is a kind of directed, intentional act. but it's a setup. So that could, that's a kind of diagram made of mud and rocks and sand or whatever. But it then allows this other process to happen, which has quite a strong degree of unpredictability. So I think for several years it was actually underwater and nobody could see it, and then it just kind of emerged. So things will happen within the kind of constraints that have been the necessary constraints that have been set up.
Latham remains a painter,
but it's not
in a way. Latham remains a painter.
Yeah, and I think the roller blind is exactly what John said last week. It's a demonstration. This is another function of a diagram. A diagram is a demonstration. This is the way Bruno Latour would talk about the kind of strength of diagrams. You don't have to explain anything; you just show it, right? But these book sculptures, the kind of material sculptures, which I kind of prefer this part of Latham's work in a way, don't seem like demonstrations. They seem like kind of allegories, kind of interesting kind of combinations that allow your kind of thought to drift off into different areas, which might be to do with language and materiality, for example.
Can I just pick up on something here, Dean, that I think I really wanted to talk about, and maybe we haven't got round to it, and maybe and it's something that Mary brought up last week. I think, Mary, you described the intuitive artist as having an intuition of the cosmic scale of events and the micro scale cosmic. That's what Latham seems to be suggesting, that somehow this revelation or this moment, you become conscious of the magnitude of the micro and the macro scales, and that somehow that's what, because I know that the diagram that I've been showing, my sort of the intergenerational matrix, is far too limited relative to Latham's consciousness of what was important. And I think he was saying we have to think in bigger magnitudes and scales, and that if we don't think about, like I say, that this glass may live longer than me, be in existence as a unified singularity, or it may not. The water is, like it's gone. The tree is 50 years, 100 years. The mountain is a million years, whatever. That all things have this temporal scale. And if we don't start thinking up through and down through the temporal scales, we aren't going to be able to solve our problems. I don't know if you want to say more about that, Mary, or how your understanding of that.
I think maybe that's why that intersection between art and science is important for Latham, because, say, lenses, and Martin Kemp, the art historian, is really interesting on this. He talks about how, lenses, for example, can be an extension of the eye. We already have a lens in our eye, but an external lens, a microscope, can give us access to cosmic scales of time that we might be able to conceptualize. Well, we can look at the sky and we can look at the stars, but a microscope can let us look at the details of the shadows and the hills on the moon. It's not smooth surface. It's something that's been impacted by other asteroids. And so that kind of knowledge, that deeper knowledge of kind of deeper scales of time that science gives us access to, is something that artists respond to within their own artworks on intuitive levels.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds about right. David, go on. Sorry.
I think that's really interesting. I was trying to point towards something just before Dean unfortunately disappeared. Because I was thinking,
they went in a time tunnel. We went in a time loop back into the 15th century.
I know what you're going to say, David. Actually, but go to say it anyway.
Somewhere there's a reality where it's a different version of me, John, and Mary.
Yes,
you're the only one, literally. So I think I thought about Daniel Dennett, who I don't know enough about his writing, and I think he might have said consciousness doesn't exist. But there is an interview in which he talks about trees having consciousness because they might repel an insect by releasing a chemical, so that they can select and they're aware of something. And so I was thinking about this in relation to Peirce, where we would say that our consciousness is perhaps more complex. But in the first, second, and thirdness diagram, what becomes interesting to me, or perhaps it's kind of obvious, is that thirdness is something that changes with things like lenses. Because if firstness and secondness are feeling and will, or we see something and we become aware of something else, the relation between those two things will change in relation to our technologies, which is one of the reasons why, John, I think you're so critical of digital technology, because it might have a negative effect on our understandings of relations, but also clearly in our consciousness and in science and art, to a certain extent, our artists are dealing with that deal with the relational, and scientists that are interested in the relational. Obviously, technology and media, lenses, computers, mathematics, and diagrams, they don't just show relations; they actually are productive of them in some way, almost in a kind of evolutionary way, perhaps. But we can also call that historically. And I think that relates to what Mary was saying about the lenses and intuition, and being able to have a cosmic consciousness, which may have been there, in lots of different cultures, but certainly it changes, and in Western culture, or scientific cultures, or cultures where they invented zero, for instance, to talk about the empty or whatever. Those ideas about what relations are change in some way.
I mean, with Peirce, there's three levels. There's three levels of the icon, right? There's a first, second, and third icon. So you have the kind of quality of an image. So you're dealing with the kind of firstness of a kind of qualia, the redness of a red or something that you might that maybe modern art, early modern art was very, very interested in, the kind of sensation of that. And then you have relation of parts, which is the diagram. But then you have the metaphor, which is a kind of thirdness in the sense that it makes a leap. I mean, it kind of leaps from a way of describing an object by using a completely different image. So this would be the level of poetic language, or allegory, or I would imagine the kind of imaginative devices that Châtelet talks about that enable scientists to get be able to use their intuition on these things. So there's always these different on the one hand, the diagram for Peirce is never purely indexical. It always involves symbols, words, numbers, whatever, and indexes, right? Little arrows and little points that tell you the date or the whatever the variables are. So there's always these kind of different things involved in actual fact. There's always these different levels of firstness, secondness, thirdness kind of involved in any kind of process. I mean, it's a very versatile kind of way of thinking about things that's kind of applicable to all kinds of things. Quite useful.
I think one of the things that's just dawned on me as we're talking is that the period that Latham identifies as the convergence point is also the beginning of cybernetics and the mathematical theory of communication, Shannon and Weaver, probably around the time UNIVAC, the first big major computer. It's the dawn of digital civilization as we know it, right? And of course, for which the zero is the elemental particle of the digital. So I don't know. Maybe there's another story to be told about if we drew the technological timeline alongside the art and science timeline, we would find a convergence with the beginning of computing, right in the centre of that. And I think that's partly maybe that's something else. And so the period after the 50s and 60s, which for Latham becomes the era of the incidental person in terms of art, which is almost like a new epoch
But there's a symbolization, isn't there? There's a kind of symbolization of energy as information. That's the big kind of new cybernetic paradigm, or at least part of it is.
Yeah.
Whereas Chatelet says, really, it begins with electromagnetism and these experiments around different poles. He says this is the beginning of loops, because computers are physical things, and we tend to lose sight of that when we focus on information as some kind of kind of disembodied kind of state. But it's really little atomic particles, isn't it? Kind of looping, managing to kind of loop in ways that we can, extract energy from them and get them to do things like make calculations, which is essentially all they do. So it's this kind of way that when that, as that gets symbolized, first of all through mathematics, and Faraday wasn't a mathematician. In fact, he was very suspicious of it, and he called himself a geometer, and that's why he was so diagrammatic in a way. But obviously with kind of Maxwell, you get the kind of mathematization of that in a kind of unified theory that then gets more unified with light and with gravity, with Einstein's equations and so on. But I mean, it's kind of interesting in terms of diagrams, which are often thought of as very, they're more like kind of Kantian schemas, I suppose, where Kant is suspicious of intuition, which is not guided by, concepts in some way. But then there's this other element, which is very, very much the kind of Chatelet Deleuze element, which is very much about drawing on something, some kind of something amorphous and material, which we're not in control of, we're not aware of, but is a kind of subterranean. I don't know.
Unconscious?
Totally unconscious or non-conscious processes that are going on that can still be put to use. Let's say they can be kind of separated out. In fact, I mean, again, I'll talk about this more next week, hopefully, but the idea of entropy, which apparently Latham didn't say much about, but the idea of entropy as a kind of separating out of things in order to kind of put these to some kind of practical or kind of instrumental or creative use.
I think for me, what's been interesting is Latham, through your talk, John, and actually through what Mary, you did last week, the question of zero has become really big for me. Like, I don't think Latham discovers anything, but he receives the information from scientists about the quantum, and it's more the question. It's not like what is zero. It's like what do you do about it, or what do you do with it in some way. And I guess the incidental person, which I have some questions about, but it's his. This is why maybe I think it's not exactly spiritual, but it's a kind of philosophical approach to the world. The introduction of zero into consciousness, which he perhaps finds in art, and that moment in art which you're talking about, it's very different to how the cyberneticists treat zero, or the scientists treat zero. And who's to say who's right? Because scientists don't tell you how to live. They tell you what the world is, what the universe is, perhaps, and they're getting there. But what you do with that's another question.
Well, perhaps, Latham, again, it's a good, interesting speculation. It's sort of there. Your work, your presentation, David, where you talked about it as a sigil, the 0110. And, there is a kind of, it seems to me that, and one of the things, the know-it that Latham talks about, it seems to me, if I understand Latham's understanding of zero, it's more like the know-it. There's no extension, because there can only be an it, a thing, when there's extension in space. I think that's Like,
I think so. Yes.
all its take up space, and if there's no extension, there can be no it.
But more than that, I think it's the consciousness of the scales that Mary you talked about last week, which is made apparent through science, and also the idea that there's no space at a certain level, like before one. There's a state, there's nothing, and then there is this extension which is precarious and temporary, perhaps, or impermanent. That seems to me part of what Latham's work is communicating in some ways. That's why I thought that the 0110 is a sigil. What I do have a question about, though, is from another perspective. If the human is not so central, and this would perhaps be too much to kind of open up now, but there would be some people like our friends who believe in the AI singularity, who see the human as one plane or step to some other kind of evolved consciousness, which will not have senses, which will not appreciate charcoal other than quantitatively, but will have a totally different consciousness of the universe, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's what I meant by why I put the image of the organism somewhere, Latham's organism somewhere.
Yeah.
That, in another dimension or another universe, that
which is definitely an allegory. That's an allegory, that, in some ways. Or it works like that, doesn't it? An organism somewhere. It seems very allegorical.
I'll just bring it up again.
Would you agree with that, Dean? Being very cautious here. Maybe I might have made.
Well, you tell me why do you think that's an allegory?
Well, allegories are, as I understand it, they stand in for things that cannot be said for various reasons, or that exist but point to something else. So, the organism somewhere as this kind of ink blot points to something else, but also kind of points to the impossibility of articulating that. So I guess that's not a Benjaminian notion of the allegory. I guess it's not a
the allegory is
more medieval.
The allegory is a framework, isn't it? It's a way of looking at the world. I mean, I think I haven't read it, but I think Jameson in his new book on allegory talks about what's the guy you were talking about who wrote the book about consciousness, the philosopher
Daniel Dennett.
So he actually does a reading of Dennett's book as allegory, like it's an allegory. So this is the kind of involution of allegory, that kind of everything. It's a question of interpretation. It's a question of reading. But I like Walter Benjamin's little phrase about the ideas, objects standing to ideas as stars stand to constellations. So that's also a way of it's a different kind of truth. It's not a kind of let's say a kind of truth as a kind of scientific materialism would kind of understand that, well, planets are real. Constellations are just these silly things that we kind of stupidly imagine from our kind of selfish kind of or our kind of egotistic kind of view that there's only one perspective on the universe come together. But of course, this is a very let's say it opens lots of little pathways and little kind of doors to other dimensions. Once we kind of take physical reality and order them in such ways that it allows a kind of political portal to open up. So I agree that this image is an allegory in that sense, I think.
And it's perhaps not a diagram in the way that and it's very similar to the diagram that you collaborate on, collaborated on and showed us earlier. But
do you mind if I just finish off a little bit?
Yeah,
something? Just it's just fine. I think just to say 110 sort of fits in there somehow, doesn't it? We all sort of, and this sort of whatever that consciousness of that changes everything for Latham. We've already talked about this. I don't want to talk too much about. I won't talk about this at all, but except to say that the idea of the happening, that art moves towards eventness. From at this period too. This is when contemporary art starts to be more about the event and the performance and liveness and non-recording, dematerialization, experience over object. This is a structural differential. And actually, all I want to do is to sort of just to finish off I've already sort of demonstrated that with the physical object, this Korzybski always insisted that it had to be a physical object. And this is perhaps why I keep returning to, going through the abstract linguistic into, actually the digital would be down here somewhere, because all of this can be coded as zeros and ones. This can also be coded as zeros and ones. But he's always encouraging us to go back for the firstness of the physical object in space and time and our experience of it, because that is what he believes we actually experience first, even in terms of development of our consciousness. So it has to be a physical object. That's all I want to say. Rather than a two-dimensional. Once you get this, you're already here. So this, the diagrammatic, is all in this space. This is a plane of assertion, in a sense. The first white space in which words and signs and marks can be made to speak back to what is going on in the world.
The only thing I think about there, though, which is interesting for me and relates to diagrams and science, is that black holes do not appear and cannot be experienced, but they did appear in the mind of John Mitchell, a friend of Newton. That's, I think, the first recorded black hole is in a letter by John Mitchell, and that's interesting. And it's not an object that you could easily put in the sieve, and I think that's not to suggest that the structural differential device is not important or doesn't work, but I think that there is something beyond this system, which starts with what's present to us, and there's something that exists without a kind of physical firstness in science, which is fascinating. The black hole has only just been photographed, like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and even that's not the black hole. We can't see inside it.
But just to say
it's a place where all, according to Wheeler, all the laws of physics collapse, and that's something important that maybe Latham is getting to with zero as well. There's no space there.
So it may be that if we follow the higher order abstracting, and Korzybski was always using indexing devices and said you've got to treat science, because he was writing in the 1930s and 40s. He said you've got to treat science 1941, not science 1500. And this is his, he was very conscious that everything is changing, including consciousness, science, our understanding of the universe, our understanding of quantum physics, and that was changing our consciousness, that we were an evolutionary consciousness that becomes aware of how things work, of what is going on, uses higher order abstractions to make theories, deductions, inferences about it, uses science to test them, uses reason and logic to test them, and eventually transforms. So he would say that when you drop the high order abstracted understanding of the cosmos back into what is going on, that it may well be that the entire thing collapses, David, and in fact this just vanishes out of existence altogether, right? Because it no longer has any ontological stability or something. I don't know what it would call it.
Well, you jump into it, you put it in, if I understand you rightly, you're pouring it into a black hole.
Okay, it's just been poured into a black hole.
Just be pulverised to near infinity.
Well,
I get
as
your
I
point.
understood it, this was kind of Stephen Hawking's kind of U-turn, wasn't it? That his theory was also that it was always that not information disappears. By information, he means any kind of matter or energy. Matter is energy. And he then later kind of accepted someone else's point that no, it doesn't. It doesn't. It comes out somehow. You can. It is retrievable. I mean, not in the same form, but
it's like you did when you went away.
Yeah, I went away and I came back, and you'd get your sculpture, as Mary called it. It'd come back, but maybe not in the same form. It might be a bit pulverized or stretched or something.
There was a debate whether information could disappear from the universe.
Yeah,
and it's a kind of impossibility. I think this was something that John Wheeler discussed with his students. But later on, Hawking, I think, came up with this. First of all, yes, he had a bet, and he accepted in the end that information didn't disappear from the universe. I think that's it. But he also had that idea of Hawking radiation, that black holes leak. But that's not quite where I was going at. I was going at somehow science goes towards things that exist only through number and imagination and intuition, and not physically for us. And I find that fascinating. And it's almost like working from language, imagination, and intuition towards perceiving the thing. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Well, we can only use what we've got, haven't we? I mean, just in the same way that the crystals on the salt crystals on the spiral jetty can only do so much. They can't go off and have an exhibition in New York or something.
Latham's trying to get us to be aware of that which is beyond perception, and the whole of art, in that history of art, is pretty much about appearance. And then there's a point, I think, that he thinks, Rauschenberg, his reading of Rauschenberg is perhaps an allegory. It's an allegory. I kind of think that there's something going on there that's a kind of analog or allegorical.
It's interesting. Of
course, allegory existed. It was very big in the 17th century, for example. So there's and 16th century. So.
But
it's not like quite the contrary, that artists
but there's a
had
shift.
never. There's a kind of modernism, I suppose, isn't it? There's a kind of way in which the phenomenological world becomes of interest.
But the thing is, the phenomenological world isn't a priority for Latham.
No, that's what I mean.
And I think that's the key thing in relation to.
It's not like artists just suddenly start talking about what is unseen or something. It's like there's a you could call it a Hegelian dialectic. There's now new ways of showing what's unseen. Given all our new knowledge and new techniques and whatever.
So the senses don't, the material of art, the senses don't become important for touching reality. So what you have left, I don't know. It might be something like the analog or the allegorical. Because how you present zero, which you can't actually, or zero, which is the quantum maybe, or pre-extension, in extension, I don't know. You've got to use language and allegory, diagrams.
You've got to keep making things and demonstrating them.
Well, that's the interesting thing. I thought when you were talking before about the lump, maybe the lump with the books in, that they all are connected through the meta diagram of the roller blind in some way. It seems to be that's how I'm reading that work now, whether Latham intended it like that. But I thought that after your talk, Mary, that everything is in that roller blind.
It's all in the roller blind.
I think that's right. Yeah, I mean these sculptures are like a kind of ectoplasm, right? They're a kind of manifestation of a particular moment or something.
Should we finish?
Yeah, do you want to finish your slides, John?
I just got I just wrote a list of parallels between Korzybski's thinking, particularly about, because of this focus on the event process level, that this idea of the event is really crucial, and it's coming out of a philosophical tradition, I say, of particularly of Whitehead and Peirce. But I just drew these correlations really between Korzybski and Latham, which I've been seeing, and I'm broadly just meaning, when I say Latham's flat time, I'm using that as a catch-all for the philosophy, really. So there's a principle of non-identity, because Korzybski is really against the is of identity and that things have identity. So things are constantly in flux. And so there's a link there between know-it and non-identity. These are just some parallels. For both, objects are temporal events and event structures. And I mean, maybe that's not quite exactly right, but that's a sort of understanding I get from both. Language and art as time binding. This was Korzybski's term, that humans are a time binding type of life, and certainly Latham seems to have sort of language and art is in relationship to like affecting the time bases or working on the time bases, that we are changing time or we're working with time as artists. This other thing, this need for a new approach to language to generate consciousness of what is happening and to avoid future disaster for humans, extinction. And again, this importance of the demonstration, which happens in real time, as things that they both share. So that was just me really finishing off my understanding of that, the relation between those two. And I just realised, while I was doing this, thanks, David, I appropriated your black hole drawing.
That's okay.
And I noticed how it's sort of like Pollock-like it is in some ways.
That's on purpose, I'm afraid. But it's also quite digital. I thought they were great, kind of axioms almost that you presented there, John. It's very interesting.
Cool. Well, I look forward to Dean's presentation next week.
We'll have to get your axioms up on the universe.
Principles,
Yes.
maybe they were.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. The time binding thing of language is we haven't got into it. We won't. But it's very interesting in relation to diagrams, which are not meant to be things that can be bound in time, but they don't function without that time binding.
No.
In some ways.
To be continued.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, John.
That's
That was
great,
really
John.
Good.
Thank you very
John.
much.
Well, good to see everybody.